Hello and welcome back to Granbury Volunteer Fire Department's Online Fire Academy. My name is Matt Hohan, Captain of Operations here at Granbury, and today we're going to cover Forcible Entry, SFFMA Section 2. Now, forcible entry at face value is a lot of fun. We get to go forth, we get to go break things, we get to tear them apart. But there's also a very practical and tactical side to forcible entry. And it's more than just breaking stuff. The best part about it is when we ask you to use forcible entry, I want that thing destroyed. Sometimes. That's the tactical side. And then the practical side is maybe we're just trying to make entry into a business to reset their fire alarm at 2 o'clock in the morning. And at that point, we can't just pull out a sledgehammer and go through the front door. So we're going to discuss these things tonight, and then on the skills portion night of this class, it'll be a lot more immersive on how to physically use the tools, and then just more situations at where they're applicable. As usual, if you have any questions, make sure you write them down. And as usual, as we go through this slideshow and make references to equipment on apparatus, please check your apparatus at your home departments and see what you guys have to use. Without anything else, let's get it started. Use of various types of manual and/or powered forcible entry tools used in our area. Now we're going to go over cutting tools, prying tools, pushing and pulling tools, and striking tools. If you're brand new to the fire department or you've been around it for a little while, I want you to answer these 4 questions real quick. Give me at least one example of what a cutting tool is. Give me one example of a prying tool. Give me one example of a pushing or pulling tool. And lastly, give me one example of a striking tool. Go ahead and write your answers down. Alrighty, now that you've written a couple of tools down, I'm going to go through cutting tools first. Any type of cutting tool, it's going to be something like a chainsaw, chop saw, a pighead axe, flathead axe, maul, rotary saw, hand saw, circular saw, anything that physically is going to allow you to cut. Okay, now from a hand tool point of view, forcible entry point of view, what we're going to be using a lot is what I just listed. Again, forcible entry is situational specific. You may be in a tight spot where you can't swing an axe. You may be in an area where you have a ton of room and you need to actually get through a relatively thick object. So this is where a chop saw or a chainsaw is going to come in. But an axe is going to be quicker. A maul is going to be quicker, but you may not have room to swing it. Now, a prying tool, pretty limited here. A lot of prying is done either with the Halligan bar or a rock bar. And if you're not familiar with those, a Halligan bar is at the bottom left picture of the slide. But prying with the Halligan bar will be covered in a lot more detail on the skills portion of the class. Now, tools that you can use for pushing: a Halligan bar, a rock bar, or a New York hook, a sheetrock claw, or pike pole. And this is just equipment that we have on our trucks. And typically when you're using a tool for pushing, it's also typically used for reach. And when you're trying to get something high in the air or a long ways away from you, a pushing and pulling tool are very handy. Now, striking is typically going to be used by a sledgehammer, a maul, or my favorite tool, the pig. And we're going to go into a lot more detail on literally how to use all of this on the forcible entry night. Now, if you have any extra tools that you have on your trucks, make sure you write them down and bring them to class so that we can actually discuss them with other people in the class. The tool category is just unlimited, and I can guarantee you all 9 departments in Hood County we have different equipment. We have a lot of the same stuff, but I can guarantee you everyone has a side tool that is their favorite. Go ahead and let everyone know. Identify the method, procedure, and proper cleaning, maintenance, and inspection of various types of the following forcible entry tools and equipment. Axe heads and cutting edges. Now, an axe is typically used as either as a striking tool or the physical axe end as an actual cutting edge. Now, with an axe, I'm a firm believer that an axe should be sharp. Now, that's department preference, and you need to verify that with your department. The sharper the axe is, the more efficient that it's going to be at physically cutting whatever you're trying to accomplish. The trick with that, though, is that if you have an axe so sharp, kind of like a razor, which has a very, very fine edge, that axe is actually going to dull very quickly. Another problem with it is that the axe itself can physically drive deeper into the wood with a really hard swing, and can actually be almost impossible to get out of the object if it's buried in and didn't cut all the way through. So with an axe, you actually want more of a shallow edge where it looks more like a roof, a pitch on a roof, and not a very steep church steeple. And to accomplish that, you're going to use a file. Don't ever use any equipment like a power grinder or just a table grinding wheel, because it's going to get the metal too hot and it's actually going to weaken the physical edge of the axe. And what will happen is it'll pit, dent, and break really easy. And once you have a blunt edge on an axe, it's really going to hinder your progress as far as cutting. Now, wooden handle tools. Wooden handle tools have to be taken care of. And the big thing that you got to watch for when using a wooden handle tool is that they're not very forgiving in the sense of when you're striking something, like let's say you have a wooden handled sledgehammer and you're swinging that hammer to hit something and you completely miss what you're trying to hit and you hit the actual wooden handle into the object you're trying to hit. If you start having major pitting and dents into the wooden handle, you can break that tool very easily. The other issue with a wooden handle tool is that as the tool ages, that wood is going to dry out and it's going to potentially splinter. So it's real important that you maintain a good smooth surface on those wooden handled tools. Fiberglass handles, it's the same idea with a wooden handle tool. We're going to go back to a fiberglass sledgehammer. If you're not actually hitting the object you're trying to strike and the handle of the tool is slamming into the object, you can fatally injure the actual hand tool and you'll cause a giant crack in the handle of the tool. And when that happens, the tool's done. You can't tape it, you can't glue it, and you need to physically take the tool out of service. Now, plated surfaces. I don't know of anyone that actually has any plated surface tools in this area, but you still have to maintain just the general appearance of the tool. And I would ask you to go to your department and ask your officers if they have any specific tools that are plated tools that they want to maintain a specific way. Now, unprotected metal surfaces. This is where it gets important. We're going to go back to an axe. You don't ever want to have a fire axe that's in service that's painted from the cutting edge all the way back. That paint, when you physically drive that tool into a wooden object, that paint gets superheated really quick because of the friction, and then it'll cool off, and it'll literally act like a glue. So when you're painting when you have a tool that's painted, you don't want the actual paint anywhere near the service edge of a striking tool. And to protect the metal surfaces, just use something like WD-40. You might use a file to physically get the surface clean, and just squirt some WD-40 on a rag and wipe the tool head down. Not the handle, you don't want to make the handle slick, but just get some WD-40 on a towel and physically wipe down the unprotected metal surfaces. That little sheen of oil will help protect that surface. And lastly, the power equipment. On the power equipment, you want to check fuel levels, oil levels, and the physical operation of the tool at the station. That way, when you're on scene, the tool will actually operate. You know it has fuel, you know it has oil, and you can use it for its intended purpose without having to worry about running out of fuel or oil. When the tool on scene is finished being used, the second it gets back to the station, make it part of getting the truck back into service. Get the tool fueled back up, get the oil filled back up, make sure the actual piece of equipment is clean. Just because it's caked with dirt and soot and anything else that might get on it from a fire scene doesn't mean that you just throw it back on the truck and then call it good to go. Get the piece of equipment cleaned back up. Now, if you have any other questions, concerns, or comments or issues with cleaning, maintenance, or inspections of tool types, and this is a big category, please write it down and please ask your department officers. And if they're not sure, just ask your questions to the instructors of the class. Identify basic construction of typical doors, windows, and walls. So we're going to go through a construction of doors, windows, and walls, and we're just going to start with the slide that we have down below, and we're going to start with the door opening. Now, guys, you always know that if you have a physical structure, the second you put a hole in it, that is the weak point of that structure. And that's been the case for thousands of years, and engineers and just general house builders have known this, and you have to reinforce the structure around the hole. And there's no different with the door. Now, the door itself, as you can see, it's going to have trimmer studs. They're just door studs that run vertically, and they're going to run all the way to the actual very top of the header board. Okay, and from there, the door itself, the 8-foot door or 6-foot door, is going to have a stud that runs across. That's also called a header, and that is going to be the bridge point. Okay, so all the weight above the door is going to be sitting on that header, and that's got to be a relatively strong piece of material. So when you're making forcible entry into a house, I'm going to ask you this question, and think about this for a second. When we're physically making damage for entry, do we want to damage the door, or do we want to damage the wood, the studs, or the header around the door? Well, don't think about that for too long. You want to damage the door, and you want to try and maintain integrity with the wood in the wall. Again, we got to seriously consider our whole reason for being at this structure. Our intent is to make entry. Our intent is not to destroy this house, much less tear it down on top of ourselves. So when you're making forcible entry through a door, you need to physically attack the door itself, not the wall studs and not the headers. Now, let's go to a window. Window's a little bit smaller than a door, but it's got the same concept. You've got trimmer studs, and you've got a window header and a window footer. Okay, the header's at the top of the window, the footer's at the bottom. And when you're breaking a window out, and maybe you have to completely remove the physical window, do we want to go after the window and the window frame, or do we want to go after the studs? It's the exact same concept. We do not want to breach the physical studs unless we have to. Now, let's say you have a downed firefighter situation, or perhaps a very large obese patient. They can't fit out their bedroom door, so you've decided that what you're going to do is cut a hole through what's left of the window down to the floor and take that individual out that hole. Same thing to consider. If you take the physical bottom of the window out to the floor, have we actually structurally compromised that structure at all? Think about that for a second. No, we have not. As long as we leave the studs in place, we can physically remove from the window footer down to the floor, and as long as those studs are there, the structure is not compromised, and it is a great exit point for downed firefighters or if we have an incredibly obese patient. But let's go to wall construction now. And here's the great question. How many wall studs can you remove before that structure is compromised? I'm going to give you a second to think about that. The short answer is the second the first wall stud is taken out, that structure is compromised. That structure could be compromised without any wall studs removed or taken out. The wall studs, what do they hold up? And this is a really trick question. What's the whole purpose of the wall? The wall itself is not holding itself up. The wall is physically holding the roof and everything above the walls in the air. So as we start taking wall studs out, we're physically taking bracing up that's holding the structure above us in the air. So we have to be very careful about just going in and demolishing wall studs. And it's something that we have to seriously consider when we're doing forcible entry or when we're doing ventilation. You need to be cautious about taking out wall studs. Now, another thing to talk about here. Let's say it's an actual metal building, okay? Well, metal buildings have metal I-beams that are run few and far between, but there is a large space in between those I-beams. Should we ever consider physically attacking one of those metal I-beams? The answer is no. There is a million types of construction here that we can talk about. We're doing basic construction. We're going to talk in more detail on this particular subject in the building construction and smoke reading class. Now, this next topic we're going to discuss is the operation of doors, windows, and locks. We're going to start with doors. The typical swinging door, inward, outward, or double swinging. A typical inward swinging door is going to be your front door or back door, and the outward swinging door is going to be an interior door. And a double swinging door, I've never seen one physically installed in a residence. I've only ever seen them in an industrial setting. Now, wooden doors are not created equal. We've all seen really cheap wooden doors, and then there's some incredibly heavy, thick wooden doors out there on the market. And your ability to get through that door is entirely determined by the type of tool you're using. One thing I would tell you to not forget on a wooden door, man, chainsaws make wooden doors go down really quick. So if you've got a wooden door with 500 locks on it, go get the chainsaw. Now, metal doors are a little more difficult, but just like we use the chainsaw for a wooden door, the chop saw is the great equalizer on a metal door. Metal doors can be incredibly heavy. They can be incredibly well constructed. And push comes to shove, that chop saw is going to go through that metal like a hot knife through butter, and it'll make short work of a lot of locking mechanisms on a metal door. Tempered plate glass doors, that's going to be your typical storefront glass door. And that door can be really tricky. Those doors can be very hard to physically break through. I highly recommend never using something like a sledgehammer, and I would actually tell you to use something like a Halligan bar and use the pick end. Get something with a fine point to break that glass. The other issue with a tempered plate glass door is once the glass finally breaks, it shatters and it goes everywhere. Cleanup is a real pain in the butt with these doors. One thing I would tell you to consider is physically look at the lock. Maybe it'd be easier to just go after the lock than physically shatter the door. Whereas with residential doors, yes, they can be incredibly expensive, but most of them aren't and are easily replaced. A tempered plate glass door, I cannot explain to you how expensive those glass doors are, especially a very large one. Those doors are thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, and a business owner is going to be much more appreciative of you having to just cut a lock to make entry to silence a fire alarm than they are of you just shattering a glass door to go in and silence the alarm. Now, revolving doors, we're lucky. We don't have to deal with those in this area, so I'm not going to talk about them. Sliding glass doors. Again, this can be residential, it can be commercial, and all sliding glass doors are not created equal again. There is multiple ways to physically get through a sliding glass door and locking mechanisms. Overhead doors, typically garage doors, but I have seen a handful of roll-up personal doors. And the trick with those doors is that they're heavy, but there also can be spring and cable or weight controlled. So if the cable or weight is compromised or the fires cause the spring to come unrolled, you may not ever be able to physically lift the door. And lastly, fire doors. Lots of businesses have fire doors. Lots of hospitals, schools, nursing homes, they have required fire doors. And fire doors, to physically open them, should require you to just pull them. But if you were ever having to do forcible entry through one, you're in for a hell of a day. Fire doors are intentionally dense. They're intentionally heavy because they're intended to have a sustained burn rating attached to them. And most fire doors in the facilities that I mentioned earlier, they're also on magnetic locks. And the intended is if the alarm goes off, those doors automatically close. They're supposed to help trap smoke in specific areas. It's also intended, we get a side benefit of just air flow control when those doors start closing and they start isolating those areas. Now, windows. Check rail windows or double hung windows. That's what you're typically going to see in most residences that have a two-window system. Casement windows or hinged windows, we're very used to seeing a lot of those. The operation on those is they typically open inwards. Projected windows, that's something that you're really only going to see in factories, and I don't know of a single projected window I've actually seen here in this area. Awning windows, if you've ever been on a vacation in a tropical environment, they're the windows that what they do is they're all slatted glass windows, and they usually have some type of little crank. The little crank spins and all the windows open in one big sheet. That type of window is very difficult for forcible entry and can be very difficult to open and close without just breaking the entire window pane out. Plastic windows for high security structures. This is your Lexan, your plexiglass, and I would tell you to just physically go around the window, break down the wall, and go through the wall to make entry, other than trying to go through the Lexan or plexiglass. You can't use a chop saw on it. The material will just melt and it'll gum up the tool. And trying to break through it with a Halligan or a sledge or a pig's going to be almost impossible, so don't worry about that. Your easiest way around plastic windows or Lexan windows is just to physically go around them. And then lastly, screened or barred windows. Any window with bars should be considered an instant firefighter killer. And what we're going to do, if we ever encounter a structure that has barred windows, we'll have a crew that goes around the structure with a chop saw, and we're going to cut the bars off the windows. Now lastly, locks. Door locking devices. There's a million different types of locks. I'm going to address very basic lock types. And the first one's just on a residential house. Your typical twisting doorknob lock, which is pretty easy to compromise. and then the deadbolt. What we're going to do is physically break the actual window, or correction, the door or the door frame around the lock. Another thing you can do is physically just use a chainsaw and cut the door from the lock, never actually having to compromise the metal or the frame. Another thing you can consider is just using a chop saw to physically cut the actual deadbolt. There's a million ways to attack residential door locks. Now, when you get to commercial and industrial and storefront, those locks become a lot more serious and they become a lot more aggressive in their attempts to stop someone from breaking in. And we're going to cover these in a lot more detail on the skills night. Lastly, window locking devices. And it's the same as the door locks. There's a million different types of window locks out there. And on top of all that, what if the homeowner hasn't opened the window in 10 years? It's going to be virtually impossible with the window even unlocked to open the window from the outside. Again, how to unlock windows and window locking devices, we're going to cover that on the skills night. Now, if you have any questions from this slideshow, make sure you write them down. Identify the dangers associated with forcing entry through doors, windows, and walls. I've already talked a little bit in detail on the construction slide about this, but we're going to reiterate it. If you're forcing entry through a wall, you have got to be careful about just starting to kick out studs. Again, what is the wall holding up? And on top of that, if you have a fire burning inside a structure and the structure is compromised by the fire, which I assure you it is, and you start physically removing a wall, how much extra stress are you adding across the entirety of that structure? Just because removing a wall might be the easiest option doesn't mean it's the best option. Now, when you're physically removing a window, always remember, go after the window frame and the window footer. And always take the wall from the window footer down to the floor. Never take the wall above the window. And when you're going through a door, you can physically attack the door frame, but never remove door studs or the door header. If you have any questions, make sure you write them down and ask someone in your department or one of the instructors. Identify the method and technique of forcible entry through any door, window, ceiling, roof, floor, or vertical barrier. This is the portion of the skills class. We're going to cover that in a lot more detail in the skills portion of the class. Now, one thing I do want to talk about is you are a firefighter and you're having to check multiple doors, or you're a long ways away from the truck and you physically don't want to walk back to the truck to grab the appropriate tool to force entry. And in this picture below, you see a firefighter kicking a door. And I want to talk about two separate stories about forcing a door as a firefighter. And the first one involves myself. This was during the tornado. We had a active search going on in multiple areas. And we'd already probably been on scene about 3 hours, and we were coming up to one of the last houses that we were going to do a primary search on. And I was standing there watching a couple of sheriff's deputies try and force their way through the door. And they couldn't do it. So I was going to be Captain Awesome. And I walked up to this door, and I got myself psyched out. And this door was going to come down. I assure you this. So I stand facing the door, and I kick the door so hard at the door lock that the entire door just goes blowing off of the hinges and goes flying across the what's left of this person's house. Well, that's all fine and grand, and I got to look super awesome to those guys, but I about threw my hip out of socket in the process of kicking the damn door so hard. You have to be careful when you're physically kicking these doors in. Another thing to be cognizant of, and this goes to the second story. This was an apartment fire here in Granbury. It was on the second floor, and the fire crew was searching their very last structure. And this door was locked. And they were going to make entry, and they faced the door, raised a foot up, and kicked the door in. They kicked the door in so hard that they actually flew in to the structure. Here's the problem. Their momentum carried them through the doorway. The problem is that the floor of the second-story apartment was gone. It had already collapsed. And the firefighter went from the second story through a whole bunch of crap, finally landed on his face and terribly on his knee, which he did break, and finally ended up on the first floor. Here's the moral of the story. When you're having to actually force a door with your body, do not throw your shoulder into it for the same reason. If the door breaks, it can forcibly give away, and your momentum will take you into the structure. And you may not want that. You may just want the door open. You don't want to just necessarily go flying into the structure. Not to mention, not if the floor's gone, but what other hazards are there? Well, you get to find out face first. A second one. I really love this picture in the bottom right, where it shows a little firefighter being a ninja as he goes and does a jumping kick into the door. I can assure you, I would never do something like that because I'm physically incapable of it, and I wouldn't want something like that on video. But also, think about the momentum of the firefighter. It's going to take them potentially through the door and into the structure, which is a no man's land. We don't know what's in there yet. Next, I don't recommend front-facing the door and kicking it. I really, really do recommend what the firefighter on the left is doing. That's called just a simple donkey kick, where you're standing flat-footed and you're kicking your leg behind you into the door you're trying to force. That way, if something happens, you're not going to go flying through the door. And I can assure you, you can generate a ton of power by kicking behind you like this. Now, as far as method and techniques for doors, windows, ceilings, roofs, and floors, and any other vertical barriers, we're going to go in more detail on that. But as far as the physical firefighter making entry and using physical manpower to make entry, use the good old donkey kick method, and don't be like me. Don't just throw your hip out of socket just to look awesome.